Mr. Speaker, before I get started on the bill, I think I just want to say to the previous speaker, Mr. Bennett, that I think he should thank the member Bakshi for looking at him adoringly the whole way through his speech, and because that was the only person that Mr. Bennett was delivering his speech to and was facing him the entire time. And I just want to say it's fantastic to see such strong relationships within the National Party caucus. So Bakshi, I think Mr. Bennett should thank you. There is a lot that I have to say about this particular bill, but I'd rather talk about the wider context in terms of the tertiary environment at the moment. However, before I get on to that, I'll touch on some of the aspects specific to this bill, which is what Mr. Bennett didn't do. Labor does support this bill as it makes some positive changes that will make it easier for borrowers to manage their loans and pay back what they owe. However, we do hold serious reservations about some aspects of it, particularly its impact on working students. We believe there are changes that need to be made at Select Committee to make sure that this bill is fairer. Overall, Treasury expects the changes will increase student loan receipts by up to $22 million a year by 2014. And we think that's a positive step forward for borrowers and the Crown. And, anything that assists people with paying back their student loans and making it easier for them is welcomed by this side of the House. I myself, only at the beginning of this year, after 14 years since having commenced study, although I finished much earlier than within the 14 years, it took me 14 years to pay that student loan off. So I know there's a few other people in the House that were in the same situation. To this end, we particularly support the changes to late payment penalties from a total 19.56% interest a year to just 10.6% or 8.6% if the student enters into instalment arrangements. We are opposed, along with the Māori Party, to the increase in the student loan establishment fee from $50 to $60. We believe that this is part of an effort by the National Government to reintroduce interest by stealth to the student loans. A second area of concern we would like to highlight is the way changes to the repayment system will impact student incomes. Under the proposed changes, students would have to begin making repayments weekly, fortnightly or monthly, depending on when they get paid. The proposal would require them to make repayments once they had earned over $367 a week. Under the current system, students only have to make repayments once they have earned over $19,084 a year. And I know my colleague, Mr. Robertson, talked a bit about that before, and that the problem with this is that many students would earn more than this each week during the holidays, but less than the $19,084 over a year. This means that some of the money they were saving through holiday jobs for the student term would have to be used to repay their loans instead, and would probably force them to increase their loans. So that's an issue that we do have with that. I think it's important, given that we are talking about student loans, to talk about, like I said earlier, what's happening in the wider tertiary sector at the moment. And we have major concerns on this side of the House with respect to that. Recently I've been out and about talking to our Pacific people that are teachers, that are academics, that are parents, and they have concerns for what's happening across the education sector. In fact, right from early childhood education through to the compulsory sector and then on to the tertiary sector, which I plan to talk about now. Under the Labor government, tertiary education did become more affordable and accessible for New Zealanders. Labor introduced the no interest while studying policy so that students were not charged interest on their student loans while they were studying. This was followed in 2006 by the introduction of universal interest-free loans for all borrowers living in New Zealand. And just going back to something that Mr. Dunn said earlier, Mr. Dunn was trying to say that the legislation that we're discussing today in the House is the most fundamental change to the legislation since its introduction in 1992, and I think that might be going a bit far, Mr. Dunn. I think as a former student and as a person that actually had a student loan, the most fundamental change was undeniably when Labor made those loans interest-free, not the useful administrative changes that are being made by this particular bill that Mr. Dunn has pushed through. Mr. Chair, Mr. Speaker, Now, those interest-free student loans that I talk about as being so fundamental and so important to people like myself who did have student loans to pay back, those were introduced in 2006. And then in 2005, the Labor government again introduced made changes to the parental income threshold for student allowances by raising it by 20%, followed by further 10% increases in 2007 and 2008. And those are the things that really matter to students, and that people that are forced to take out student loans because they don't have the parents who have the means to pay their fees, or they don't have it themselves. Mr Dunn, rather than the administrative changes that we see as useful that you've made in this bill, but hardly the most fundamental thing to have ever been done with student loans. Now, what we saw from that side of the House, the national government, or what we've seen over the last 2 years almost, are a series of changes, a series of cuts to our education system across the board, each and every one of the sectors, including a $349 million cut over the next 4 years from student loan funding. Now, this is through restricting access to student loans, requiring students to pass more than 50% of their full-time courses over 2 years to be able to keep borrowing from the student loan scheme, introducing a lifetime limit on access to student loans, 7 years from an undergraduate degree, and preventing permanent residents and Australians from accessing a student loan until they have lived in New Zealand for at least 2 years. Now, on paper, some people might look at that and think that, well, that kind of sounds fair, but we know the implications of it and know that it is, in fact, not fair. And what this means is that restrictions will result in 17,000 students losing access to student loans, and for our Pacific community, the implications are even more prevalent, with a disproportionate number, 2,500 of those 17,000 students being Pasifika. Now, that equates to 10% of all Pacific students currently receiving a student loan. The introduction of student loan restrictions is a huge setback to the government's tertiary education strategy 2010 to 2015 and its goal of increasing the number of Pacific students achieving at higher levels. Now, what we've seen recently is concerns being raised by several different ministries, including the Ministry of Pacific Island Affairs, who have stated that the package may result in Pasifika students dropping out of university and going on to the unemployment benefit or shifting to cheaper avenues of study. Both of those things hardly seem aspirational, like using that word that the national government seems to like to use, but yet that side of the House would continue down that track and put these types of changes into place. Mr Speaker, what we're concerned about is that under the Labor government, the number of Pasifika children in early childhood education increased, the number of the percentage of Pacific young people achieving NCEA level 2 increased, the number of Pacific school leavers taking part in modern apprenticeship schemes increased, and the number of Pacific students in tertiary study grew faster than any other ethnic group. And yet all of that at the moment is at risk because of decisions being made in the tertiary education sector by the national government. Decisions being made that show that actually that side of the House has a lack of aspiration for Pacific people in education, that side of the House is neglectful of Pacific communities at all stages of education, and that side of the House undervalues Pacific people, culture and heritage, and also the importance of the contribution that the Pacific community does make, currently makes, has made, and will need to make in the future. We heard from Mr Foss that the changes that the national government are making are supposed to be fairer on the taxpayer. Well, let's keep in mind that it's the young people that are actually taking up their student loans, engaged in tertiary study or intending to engage in tertiary study, that will be the taxpayers of the future and will have to pay back the debt that that government on that side of the House has incurred for our country. So they won't be there because they'll be sitting pretty in their retirement villages over in Hawaii or wherever, leaving that debt to be paid back by the young New Zealanders that they're saying that they're trying to restrict access to student loans for. So, Mr Speaker, I'll end it there, but I think we do, like I said, we do support this particular bill that we're discussing in the House today,